It's hard for any artist to imagine the lasting impact of the work that they create. Sometimes I try to put myself in the mindset of some of my favorite creators when I revisit their seminal works. Like, did Vince Gilligan think that someone would rewatch Breaking Bad every single year when he was directing the pilot in 2008 or when the finale premiered in 2013? Does George Lucas ever just sit and comprehend the legacy of the Star Wars universe, or how many stories will still be told in that universe years after he's gone? It's one thing to create a work of art that's going to be revisited over and over by a dedicated fan base, but it's another thing entirely to imagine creating something that actually becomes a tradition. Something that is almost guaranteed to live on for the rest of time because an entire seasonal celebration is associated with it. And as insanely gifted as he was, I don't think that in 1843, when Charles Dickens sat beside candlelight and drafted A Christmas Carol, that he could have ever dreamed of the heights of recognition that this 30,000-word novella would reach in the almost 180 years since its publication. It's a testament to the staying power of a work of art that after even over a century, I don't really have to even introduce this story to you. You already know it, whether you've actually read the original source material or not. The adaptations are plenty, the themes are universal, and the characters have made their way into popular culture. When something becomes so popular, it does run the risk of eventually being looked at as overrated or annoying. Some of the most beloved Christmas movies, TV specials, and songs have the potential to become insufferable and have garnered a reputation of being so. Yet somehow, A Christmas Carol endures. It's rare to meet someone who dislikes this story, and I think that's because, despite its overwhelming popularity, it is a story that is still worth revisiting. As with any piece of classic literature, it is filled with symbolism and deeper meanings between the lines that can sometimes get left behind in some adaptations. The first time I actually read this story, I was blown away by how much Dickens was able to get across in such a short book. It stands out from the crowd of other Christmas stories in its content. Told in only 5 chapters, or staves, it doesn't waste a single word. Being a Dickens story, it can be witty and sometimes comedic, but it has an edge. The often overlooked subtitle is A Ghost Story of Christmas, and the horror elements are not played down at all. This is a story about terrifying someone with their own far-reaching actions and impact so that they may become a better person. Its social criticisms were very strong for the time and still find relevancy today. So I reread the novella and watched a ton of adaptations of it. For this video, I'd like to take a look at what I consider to be the ultimate Christmas story and explore why I think it still survives to this very day. Any look into A Christmas Carol would be incomplete without an understanding of the man who wrote it. If you're familiar with any of his other works, you'll know that the struggles of those in poverty was a common theme for Charles Dickens, and exploring his past makes it very clear why. At the age of 12, his father was arrested and sent to a debtor's prison, forcing the young Dickens to have to get a job working 10-hour days at a shoe blacking factory. The experiences he had there never truly left him, and they could be found documented in the novels that would make him famous. Oliver Twist firmly established his reputation as a writer that spoke for the people, shining a light on the struggles of the working class, specifically children. During a visit to the Cornish tin mines, Dickens would become appalled to see young children working in such horrible conditions, and the memories of his childhood labor and the imprisonment of his father by debt would come rushing back. This planted the seed for his story, and upon observing the increasing popularity of Christmas in the Victorian era, he now had the perfect setting. He began writing A Christmas Carol in October of 1843, completing one of the most iconic stories in all of literature in only 6 weeks. In that short amount of time, Dickens would create some of the most enduring characters in all of fiction. Some of my favorite types of characters in all of fiction are ones that go through a story of redemption. The people who we know deep down are capable of great kindness and compassion, but along the way find themselves making mistakes and heading down the path of darkness. It's only when these characters have hit their lowest that someone or something enters their life that reminds them of who they once were and the compassion that they can be capable of. It's through these characters' trials that we see them come out on top again, usually an even better person than they were before. Ebenezer Scrooge deserves his recognition amongst the best of these characters. It's common knowledge that Scrooge begins his story as a stingy, miserly old man, but sometimes I don't think that part of his character is played up enough in many of the story's adaptations. Scrooge is cruel, freezing his office in the middle of the winter, only allowing a single coal to burn in the fire and berating his kind office clerk any chance that he gets. He even tells his nephew that he'd rather see him in hell than go to his Christmas party. Dickens describes Scrooge with terms fitting the villain of a story rather than its protagonist. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Just how far his willful ignorance toward the common people's needs goes is perfectly exemplified when two men come into his office seeking donations to provide food and warmth for the poor. Not only does he refuse to extend any help whatsoever, he also insists that the poor should go to the workhouses or prisons if they truly wish to get off the streets. When asking the two men if these establishments are still in operation, he specifically asks if the treadmill is in full vigor. The penal treadmill, or everlasting staircase that he's referring to here, was a device that prisoners were forced to walk for up to 6 hours a day as a form of cruel punishment. Scrooge is a man who views the importance of a thing by its value, and those who don't directly bring him profit or give away their means by celebration of a holiday like Christmas, he sees as having no value at all. One of the men tells Scrooge that many of the poor would rather die than be imprisoned or forced into labor at a workhouse, and Scrooge replies to this with his cruelest piece of dialogue in the entire book.
If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
Ebenezer Scrooge at the beginning of the story is the ultimate caricature of the rich and elite upper class, who have no care for who they have to step on to get to the top. To transform into a better man, Scrooge has to be shown an example of the type of man he should be. This man is his clerk, Bob Cratchit. While Scrooge is miserable with much, Cratchit is very happy with little. His home is modest, his pay barely enough to get by, and his hours way too long for that to be. He has to practically beg Scrooge for the day off on Christmas. Despite all of this, while we see Scrooge dine alone in a dead hall, we see Cratchit surrounded by those he loves and those who love him on Christmas Day. He values his own situation highly, the love of his wife and many children being the most important thing to him. Dickens created Scrooge as a representation of the debtors who desperately need to change, reminding us of who we should never be, no matter what success we have, and he created Cratchit to represent who we all should strive to be, no matter our circumstances. On Christmas Day, surrounded by his family, Bob Cratchit seems on top of the world. He even gives a toast to Scrooge, who doesn't deserve it at all. The optimism of Bob Cratchit is passed down to his youngest child, Tiny Tim. If it wasn't clear already, the characters in Dickens' stories were often stand-ins for people in the real world. If Scrooge is to be seen as the face of the greedy elite, and Bob Cratchit the struggling everyman, then Tiny Tim is the face of the impoverished youth, and how they are often the ones most in need of help. Tiny Tim is in very poor health, something that Scrooge could easily improve would he take a moment to even consider his employee's family situation. Despite what Tiny Tim is going through, he is just like his father, always wearing a smile and never letting his circumstances get him down. So, we've seen the man that Scrooge chooses to be. Want has turned him into a reclusive miser, and ignorance has left him cold to those he has the means to help. Where this story truly begins is when we are introduced to the specter who gives Scrooge a glimpse into his afterlife should he continue down this path. Dragging heavy chains into Scrooge's chambers, we meet the ghost of his old business partner, Jacob Marley. In life, Marley was the same as Scrooge, and because of this, he now exists in eternal agony. Wailing of his misery at being forced to literally bear the weight of his misdeeds in the afterlife in the form of heavy chains made of heavy cash boxes, keys, padlocks, and steel purses. He is made to forever wander the earth, unseen and unable to share any of the wealth he had in life, as it is now completely useless. For Marley, it's too late. The realization that his actual business should have been the common welfare only came when his body went cold and he began to truly pay for his lifetime of greed. Marley died 7 Christmas Eves before the beginning of A Christmas Carol and tells Scrooge that his own chain was as massive as Marley's back then. Despite this, while it may be for Marley, it isn't too late for Scrooge. Marley brings his old partner a chance at hope, telling him that he will be haunted by 3 spirits before departing. Watching Marley leave, Scrooge is shown many other tortured souls bound in chains roaming the night before finally going to bed. All the ghosts in the story hold a mirror to Scrooge, showing him what he was, is, and could be. Marley is a grim vision of the world that awaits him when he leaves this world, offering him no comfort should he choose to remain the same. The image of a wailing spirit wrapped in chains is just one of the many icons that Dickens would create in this story. The herald of the spirits, and the 3 spirits themselves. Our present lives are defined by our experiences. We can often draw on moments that happened days, months, or years ago that have had a major impact on our behaviors. The choices we make can have a lasting impact, much bigger than we may realize at the time. And the person that we are now, whether slightly or significantly, is a different person than who we were. But the past doesn't have to simply be lived in to make a difference on us now. By pausing in the present and taking a reflective look to the past, we can seek to change for the better, to reclaim the good of who we once were, or avoid the mistakes that brought out the bad aspects of us now. There is a power in looking to the past. The ghost of Christmas past is the physical manifestation of that power. The spirit is described as physically contradictory, looking like a child, yet old at the same time. Its hair white with age, yet its face pristine without a single wrinkle. It holds a branch of holly, yet its dress is trimmed with summer flowers. I see this contradiction like the way we view the past. When you hold an old photograph of yourself, the physical picture itself is many years old. What it's printed on has aged over the years. It may even be slightly damaged with a tear or a stain, but you in the photo are perfectly preserved, frozen in a moment in time. The you in the photo hasn't aged at all, but the photo itself has. This is what it's like to look into the past. There's a sense of whimsical nostalgia and youth, as well as the realization of all the time that's gone by. The spirit appears before Scrooge glowing brightly and carrying an extinguisher for a cap. When Scrooge requests that it put the cap on, it accuses him of creating the cap and forcing it to wear it for many years, not allowing it to glow brightly at all. This symbolizes Scrooge's burying of his past and wanting to forget. When the spirit takes him to revisit several moments of his youth, it tells him that what he is seeing is but the shadows of what have been that are cast by its light. It's interesting that what we are shown isn't necessarily the villain origin story that one might assume it would be. Scrooge did have a lonely childhood, having been sent to live at a school far away from his family, but he was brought back home by the kindness of his younger sister, who convinced his father to allow him to return. We also see Scrooge in the employ of a generous boss who actually celebrates Christmas with his employees. These memories are pleasant, and we are shown a Scrooge that is happy in them, being treated well, treating others well, and living a good life. Things truly change, however, when we are shown that Scrooge was once in love. It is with the reveal of his past romantic history that the truth of the past and what Dickens is trying to say about it becomes clear. No major traumatic event happened to Scrooge that made him into a monster. Nothing was done wrong to him. He was the one that did wrong. He fell in love with the pursuit of money more than the pursuit of the woman who wanted a life with him. Want became his focus. He looked to what he could gain rather than what he already had. She left him because of his choices. It's nobody's fault but his. It's easier for us to look back on how we were wronged and place blame on forces out of our control. But to truly look at where we went wrong in our past is one of the hardest things to do. It's because of this that we usually try to block out the past, to keep it where it is, in distant memories that we try so hard to forget. And upon seeing this moment in his life, Scrooge does exactly that. He demands that the spirit return him home away from these moments, and it calls him out for trying to blame it for simply showing him what he had done. In anger, Scrooge snatches the cap from the spirit and extinguishes it. Just like he had done for so many years, he buries his past, snuffing it out in an attempt to forget it. In his first encounter with the three spirits that will haunt him, Scrooge fails. Will these memories aid in changing him? Yes. But are they alone enough to do so? No. To truly change, simply looking behind you isn't enough. You also have to look right in front of you. We're going to get to the adaptations of A Christmas Carol here in a little bit, but I want to point out that in many of the adaptations that I've seen, one word is often changed. In the original text, Marley tells Scrooge that he will be haunted by three spirits, and in many of the filmed versions that I've watched, that line is changed to visited by three spirits. It's a minor change, but the next ghost that visits Scrooge, I think, is truly the first to haunt him. The ghost of Christmas Present may not seem like the most haunting of ghosts when it's first introduced. He actually seems quite the opposite. He sits above a grand feast of food in a decorated room with a glowing torch, laughing and smiling, a jolly giant of a being that delights in showing Scrooge the good people going about their Christmas day. It carries a rusty old scabbard for a sword that isn't present, symbolizing peace. The spirit leads Scrooge to the home of Bob Cratchit and his family, showing him how they make the most out of their day despite their meager circumstances. This is the first time that Scrooge has ever really got a glimpse of the life that his employee has outside of their office, and when he finally sees Tiny Tim for the first time, he shows concern as to whether or not the boy will live. The ghost of Christmas Present is the most outwardly critical of Scrooge, bluntly telling him that he sees no future where the boy does not die if nothing is changed. When Scrooge becomes upset over this, the spirit throws his own words right back at him. For the first time, Scrooge truly hears the harsh words that he said, and he's ashamed of himself.
But if he is to die, then let him die, and decrease the surplus population.
Perhaps even more challenging than looking into our past is observing how we behave right now. Pride often keeps us from admitting that we're in the wrong. This moment in the story always stuck out to me when I first read it. Imagine if you were constantly being recorded and said something terrible without even thinking, and then someone immediately showed you what you said. This segment of the story asks the question, if we could see how we behave affects others right now, would we change? Scrooge has the wealth to change Tiny Tim's situation almost immediately, and Tim is only one of many just like him or worse. An element of the story that isn't often shown in adaptations of it are the moments where the spirit guides Scrooge to places where struggling working-class people still take the time to have a Merry Christmas. The home of a group of miners or ships at sea, all where workers would sit and drink in celebration. All of these people, despite their circumstances, coming together, while Scrooge can't even be bothered to visit his own family member who wants nothing more than his company. He watches the dinner party hosted by his nephew, and his heart is warmed by the experience, especially when his nephew toasts to him a Merry Christmas, knowing full well that his uncle would never accept it. I see this moment as a reflection on how we often make ourselves feel alone when that's simply not true. In my own experience, recognizing the truth that you have family or friends that want nothing more than to see you happy is one of the greatest feelings in the world. It's easy to convince yourself that it's just you against everything else, but the truth is, that's rarely ever the case. Scrooge and the spirit visit many more homes, as well as a jail and a hospital. Everywhere they go, they find the joy of Christmas triumphing over any darkness. It's at the end of their night together that things take a turn. Scrooge notices that the ghost of Christmas Present has aged considerably in the short time that they've spent together. Just like in real life, the present fades quickly. We too often take for granted the opportunities that are given to us, only realizing what a gift the time that we currently have is when it's gone. How often have you turned around and realized just how many years ago that thing that felt just like yesterday was? The spirit aging so quickly is the manifestation of that truth that the present is only the present for a short while before it becomes the past. It's right here that we experience what I believe to be one of the more disturbing sequences in the book. Scrooge notices something sticking out of the spirit's robes, and he is shown two emaciated children, a boy and a girl. They're described as yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. The spirit tells Scrooge that they are man's children. The boy is ignorance, and the girl is want. He warns him to beware of both, but especially ignorance, stating that ignorance spells doom for humanity. Scrooge has known these two children all his life. He lost everything he loved for his want of money and material things, and his ignorance toward the needs of those around him has led to direct and indirect suffering. When Scrooge shows concern for the children, asking the spirit if they have any refuge or resource, it again throws his words right back at him.
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
This is what I meant earlier by haunting. Scrooge is haunted by what he causes, haunted by what he said, and haunted by what he has refused to do. And with this haunting, the ghost of Christmas Present vanishes, and Scrooge is given his final lesson. He has confronted his past, been haunted by his present, and there's only one place left to look toward. The mood of the story drastically changes when the shady phantom of Christmas yet to come appears before Scrooge. Unlike every being that has guided him, this one never utters a single word, nor makes a sound. All it does is gesture with an outstretched hand. Early depictions of death itself influenced the appearance of the ghost of Christmas future, cloaked in all black with no flesh visible, being nearly impossible to detach from the darkness of the night. What it proceeds to show Scrooge is the effect that the recent death of a mysterious, cruel man has had on the world around him. A group of men discuss the deceased, only showing any interest in attending the man's funeral if lunch is provided. They make light of a man's death, and Scrooge recognizes them. When he looks to the spirit for an explanation, he's only met with silence. The scene moves to a cleaning woman who has stolen the deceased man's personal goods to sell. The way she speaks of the man horrifies Scrooge, and he again speaks to the spirit, claiming to understand what it all means. He says that this man's unhappy life might be his own if he doesn't change. Suddenly, Scrooge finds himself in the cold chambers where the body of this mysterious man lay covered. The dark figure points to the body, silently demanding Scrooge to look upon it, but Scrooge refuses, claiming that he doesn't have the power to do it. Scrooge then begs the phantom to show him any person that feels some level of emotion brought upon by this man's death. He is then shown a vision of a family. A mother is expecting her husband to return home with some news. Her husband tells her of the man's death, and the two are actually relieved, as he was in charge of their debts, and his dying has bought them some time to sort out their affairs. The emotion that Scrooge was hoping to see connected to the dead man was only that of relief. It's at this moment right here in the story that I remember the history of Charles Dickens. How his father was sent to prison for debt. This family here could have been his own family. At this moment in the story, Dickens comments on how a family can be torn apart and become enslaved to debt. Scrooge, feeling more desperate than ever, demands to be shown some tenderness connected with a death. With this, the ghost leads him to the Cratchit family, where Scrooge is devastated to learn that Tiny Tim has died. Bob Cratchit tries to hold it together for the sake of his family, but breaks down in sadness before going to be with the boy's body upstairs. After watching the Cratchits try to look positive toward the future, Scrooge turns to it and asks who the man was that he saw lying dead. Again, he is met with silence. As it is in life, the future at large is a mystery. The past and present can and do speak to us. We can recall an important moment from years ago and find a lesson in it. We can pause in our present life, look at how we conduct ourselves, and try to do better. But the future is often without warning. It is certainly coming, but it doesn't tell us that it is. All we can do is try to prepare for it, but we can't ask it what will be. Scrooge has a rare opportunity to ask that question, and he does so standing in the final destination of his journey, a cemetery. The ghost of Christmas yet to come points to a grave, and Scrooge asks if what he has seen are the shadows of things that will be or things that may be. He asks if there is any hope at changing what he has seen. Again, silence. Scrooge looks down to read the name on the stone. Ebenezer Scrooge. He breaks down into tears and clutches at the Phantom's robes. In the climax of our story, Scrooge makes his case that he will be a different person, that he is no longer the man that he once was, that he will honor the past, the present, and the future, and never forget their lessons. As he cries out his impassioned plea, he finds himself back in his room on Christmas Day. It is at the end of our story that we see a very different man than the one we started with. Ebenezer Scrooge completely transforms into a kind, benevolent, giving person. In the final chapter, he anonymously provides the Cratchits with a massive feast, attends his nephew's Christmas dinner, makes a ridiculously huge donation to the two men who he had treated so harshly before, and finally vows to help Bob Cratchit and his struggling family, saving Tiny Tim's life. And with those final paragraphs, A Christmas Carol was catapulted into popular culture. The legacy of this story is ongoing and was felt almost immediately. The phrase Merry Christmas, while not invented by A Christmas Carol, was popularized by it, now becoming the typical season's greeting that it is. Of course, the most iconic phrase that came from the story was
Humbug! 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 Humbug!
The word humbug is actually defined as a person or object that behaves in a deceptive or dishonest way, meaning that Scrooge at the beginning of the story saw all the happiness around Christmas as false. Right along with humbug, the word Scrooge was added to the Oxford Dictionary as a term for a stingy, miserly person. The legacy of this story continues to this very day with the many, many, many retellings of it. On Christmas Day in 1853 at Birmingham Town Hall, Charles Dickens would read his own novella publicly to the Industrial and Literary Institute. 3 days later, he would read the story for an audience of working-class people. This was a massive success, and Dickens would continue to go on tour with these public readings all the way until 1870, when he would pass away at the age of 58. Almost immediately, theater adaptations were written and produced, with performances being a staple of the season every single year. In 1901, the first surviving adaptation of the story was filmed, a short film entitled Scrooge or Marley's Ghost. What you're looking at right now was shot over 120 years ago, and while it may be the first, it certainly wouldn't be the last screen adaptation of A Christmas Carol. Just go type the title into IMDb and be met with that wall of search results that you get. The list goes on and on forever, and there is no way I'm going to be able to cover all of them. But I'd like to point out a few. I'd also like to mention that for this video, watching version after version of this story never got old to me. I think that's due to how flexible this story can be. There are just so many ways to go about portraying these characters and moments that there's always something new that a filmmaker can bring to the table that separates their vision from the ones before them. That, and also, I just love hearing these lines of dialogue. Dickens was a fantastic writer, and watching so many great actors bring his words to life is just a ton of fun. When discussing filmed versions of this story, it's hard to try and pick the best actor that played the part of Scrooge. For many fans, the 1951 version starring Alastair Sim is one of the best, if not the best. Sim is just phenomenal in this part, perfectly portraying the character's miserable cruelty in the beginning and his gleeful excitement at a second chance at the end.
I haven't taken leave of my senses, Bob. I've come to them.
One of the more interesting versions is the 1970 musical version of the story starring Albert Finney. The added songs were popular enough that this version was actually adapted into a stage musical. Also, Alec Guinness appears as the ghost of Jacob Marley, the second most famous ghost he would play in his career. These were theatrically released films, but a TV production might actually have the definitive live-action version of this story. In 1984, the novella would be adapted as a made-for-television movie. Again, it's hard to pick who played Scrooge the best, and that's ultimately up to your personal preference, but I think it's undeniable that George C. Scott was born to play this role.
Humbug.
I love the way that he plays him like he's always thinking, hiding his true emotions until the very end. His Scrooge is less outwardly angry and more smug, like he thinks he's better than everybody.
My head for business has furnished him employment.
Is that all you've learned by observing this family on Christmas Day?
Oh, no, not all, but one must speak up for oneself, for one's life.
Also, David Warner and Roger Rees do fantastically as Bob Cratchit and Scrooge's nephew. Another thing worth mentioning is that across all adaptations, it's fun to see how they interpret the ghosts themselves, specifically the Ghost of Christmas Past. This character varies in whether they're played by a man or a woman, or how they're designed. Some try to be as close as possible to the book, and others take more liberties with it. The George C. Scott version easily has my favorite portrayal of the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. Just look at this thing. It just has such an eerie presence to it, added to by the otherworldly sounds that it makes. Another produced for TV version to note is the Patrick Stewart version from 1999. This one adds a few extra scenes and had some pretty wacky CGI effects it wanted to show off for the time. This version was actually produced because of Patrick Stewart doing a series of successful one-man shows based on the story. While we've been looking at direct adaptations of the novella, it's also fun to look at works that were more inspired by the story, modernizing it or taking a new spin on it. Probably the most famous version of this is Scrooged, starring Bill Murray as a greedy TV executive that gets the Ebenezer Scrooge treatment to help him find his Christmas spirit again. Many years before Scrooged, a television movie starring Henry Winkler was produced called An American Christmas Carol. It's set during the Great Depression and stars Winkler as an American businessman counterpart to Ebenezer Scrooge in a lot of makeup. You've also got existing properties that pay tribute to the story by telling it in their own worlds with their own iconic characters taking on the equally iconic roles. For this, I can't not talk about The Muppet Christmas Carol, one of the all-time best versions of this story. A lot of that is due to the charm of the Muppets themselves, watching them play these characters with their own specific brand of humor. But the other major thing that this version has going for it is Michael Caine as Ebenezer Scrooge. It's a well-known fact for fans at this point, but if you didn't know, Caine insisted that he wouldn't play this character any lesser just because he was in a Muppet movie. He stated that he was going to act like he was doing any other dramatic performance on stage, and it pays off. The bitterness at the beginning and the joy at the end all feel truly authentic, and he just belongs in this part perfectly. Also, they crafted these new Muppets for each version of the spirits, and they all look great, as any Jim Henson creation did. I really love the Ghost of Christmas Past here. It's such a unique spin on it. The songs are great, the atmosphere is haunting when it needs to be, and charming when it earns it. It's just a fantastic adaptation. Now, you can't have an hour-long video about animation on your channel and not mention the animated versions of A Christmas Carol. One of the absolute best was released in 1971 and was directed by legendary animator Richard Williams. Williams was known for his very smooth and hyper-detailed style, and his work here truly feels like the illustrations from the original novel come to life. And if you're a fan of the 50s version, Alastair Sim and Michael Hordern both reprise their roles as the voices of Scrooge and Marley in this version. Speaking of Marley, this is hands down my favorite interpretation of this character ever done. I just love this creepy ass design, specifically the way his jaw hangs open and the voice just comes out without any movement at all. It's appropriately disturbing.
Business! Mankind was my business.
This Academy Award-winning short is definitely one worth checking out if you haven't seen it already. Of course, a lot of people growing up around my age will have fond memories of the Robert Zemeckis version starring Jim Carrey released in 2009. While I do have my issues with it, specifically with the comedy going a little too far and some scenes being unnecessarily extended, there are some excellent things done here, and it's easily my favorite thing to come out of this weird era of motion capture Zemeckis. That motion capture allowed Jim Carrey to actually be able to play not only Scrooge, but the three spirits as well, adding this new layer of meaning to the characters, like their best qualities were part of Scrooge all along, and he just had to realize it. Jim Carrey is a gifted dramatic actor, and I think the scenes at the beginning are genius. He gets across all that hatred with each line, not going too over the top like you would assume. He really nails it here.
Then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
The amount of adaptations that we get every single year from this story is just nuts. Spirited with Ryan Reynolds came out not too long ago, and most recently there was a new animated version called Scrooge. It's an animated musical that's actually based off the Albert Finney musical from the 70s. I haven't had the chance to watch it yet, but the animation in this trailer looks stunning. There's a lot to cover here, but I thought I would wrap it up with my personal favorite version of A Christmas Carol. I can't tell you about the first time I watched this version because it's been an annual tradition for me and my brothers to watch it for as long as we can remember. It's only a little over 20 minutes long, but I think that it gets the spirit of the original story down so perfectly that you need to check it out if you haven't already. Mickey's A Christmas Carol is just a perfect little short film where not a single moment is wasted. It's funny, it's charming, it's sad, it's scary, everything that the original story is, just featuring your favorite Disney characters. Ebenezer Scrooge is portrayed by Scrooge McDuck, and growing up on DuckTales tapes as a kid along with this special, it just made sense to me that this greedy character with a heart of gold deep down inside would be perfectly fit for this part. Donald, of course, plays his nephew, Mickey and Minnie are the Cratchits, Jiminy Cricket is the Ghost of Christmas Past. Part of the fun of watching this is seeing who they assign these parts. The personalities all match up very well, and when they don't, it just adds to the comedy. The more that I think about it, the funnier it gets that Goofy is Jacob Marley. This terrible person who is doomed to eternal punishment is played by Goofy. Hearing him talk about robbing widows and swindling the poor is just surreal, and of course, we can't not have a classic Goofy yell in there to end an already funny scene. While it's definitely comedic, the short can be appropriately harsh when it needs to be. The way that Scrooge talks down to people has the right amount of edge to it, and the scenes where he realizes how wrong he's been tug at your heartstrings with every line delivery. This is due to the superb performance of Alan Young, debuting in this short as the character he would voice for over 30 years until his passing in 2016. He also helped to write this version of the story, and that dedication comes through in the performance.
It's just another work day, and any jackanapes who thinks else should be boiled in his own pudding.
That writing is just fantastic, specifically toward the ending when we get to the Ghost of Christmas Future. There's no dialogue here to explain it, but you know what happened to Tiny Tim through Mickey's devastating facial expressions. And when Scrooge's own grave is revealed to him, the Ghost of Christmas Future actually speaks, delivering a line that is so chilling, I was genuinely shocked to find it nowhere in the original story.
Why, yours, Ebenezer. The richest man in the cemetery. Please.
This horrifying image aside, the ending is as wholesome as you would expect. Watching Scrooge go to Cratchit's house with a bag of toys, trying to contain his excitement while Tiny Tim investigates the bag, it just puts a big dumb smile on my face every time. Whatever version of this story you choose to experience, I do think it's important to ask the question, why Christmas? Ultimately, Dickens wrote a story about a greedy man who is shown the error of his ways and changes for the better. This story could have been set during any time of the year and still have been pretty powerful. But it's because Dickens knew how important Christmas was that the story sticks around to this day. It's the end of another year, a time where we look back on our actions that led us here, a time for New Year's resolutions and celebrations of another year down. The spirit of the holiday is one defined by goodwill toward men. Dickens compels us to look at how we live at what should be the most wonderful time of the year and ask if we've done enough, if we're happy to be alive and loved like Bob Cratchit and his family, or if we're not, to change like Scrooge, to be better people. With every telling of this story, it may inspire someone out there to be better, and to start by simply wishing another passerby Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. And that is exactly what I'm going to leave you with. Have a great rest of your year. Go watch A Christmas Carol, there's plenty of versions to choose from. Also, try and make time to read the original novella. It's not that long and it's totally worth it. However you celebrate, whatever you celebrate, I wish you a safe and happy holiday season. Thanks for sticking around for another video.